All right, so today we're diving into one of those mysteries that just never seems to go away,
Right.
the Zodiac Killer.
Yeah, and this is one that I know a lot of you out there are really interested in.
Yeah, I mean, that's got everything right.
It's got it all.
Ciphers and codes.
Ah,
This weird costumed killer.
taunting letters.
I mean, it's made for like a podcast deep dive.
Absolutely. And knowing our listeners, they like to, really get into these topics, but in a way that doesn't, totally overwhelm them with details.
Yeah, so today what we're going to do is we're going to lay out all the key facts of the case.
Yeah.
Walk through the timeline, who are the main suspects, what was the Zodiac all about, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a really solid understanding of, you know, why this case has captivated people for, over 50 years.
Exactly. And why it remains unsolved.
Yeah, so to start off, let's go back to the very beginning, the first confirmed Zodiac attack. And for you listening, this took place on December 20, 1968. Two teenagers, David Faraday, who was 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, who was 16, were found shot to death on Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California.
Tragic.
And what's really eerie about this first attack is that there were no witnesses.
Right.
There was no apparent motive.
Just random.
Yeah, the police at the time were basically stumped. They kind of just chalked it up to, maybe a random act of violence by someone they called a madman, just someone who wanted to kill.
And that's what makes this case so unsettling right from the start. It's this seemingly motiveless act of brutal violence, and I think that's what really grabs people's attention from the get-go.
Yeah, and it's important to remember this is 1968. Things were different back then. The idea of a serial killer who communicates with the media, sends ciphers and all that, that wasn't really a part of the public consciousness yet.
Right. It was really the Zodiac who kind of ushered in this era of the media-savvy serial killer.
Well, this first attack, it really just left everyone kind of shaken and confused,
Wow.
and sadly, it was just the beginning.
Yeah, and this is where the timeline gets even more interesting. The next attack takes place on July 4th, actually going into the 5th, 1969. It's just a few months later.
Okay.
This time it's at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Another couple, Darlene Farron, 22 years old, and Michael Mageau, who was 19, were attacked in their car.
And this time it was a different kind of attack.
It was a shooting, yeah, but
Yeah.
this time they used a 9mm handgun.
Different from the .22 used in the first attack.
Exactly. And crucially, Michael Mageau survived this attack,
Oh, wow.
which means we have a witness, a firsthand account of what happened.
That must have been incredibly valuable for the investigator.
Oh, absolutely. To have someone who could describe the assailant, maybe provide details about the attack itself, that's huge for any investigation.
Did Mageau's account help them connect this shooting back to the Lake Herman Road murders?
Well, not immediately, no. But here's where things took a really significant turn. Shortly after the Blue Rock Springs attack, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call. And the caller claimed responsibility for both the shooting and for the murders of Faraday and Jensen.
Well, hold on. So this is the first time the killer reaches out to the police.
It is. And this phone call is crucial because it's the first time we see this pattern of communication that would become a hallmark of the Zodiac case.
So they're starting to realize that these seemingly random killings are actually connected.
Exactly. And it's this phone call that really kicks off the whole, cat and mouse game between the Zodiac and law enforcement.
So what did the caller say exactly?
Well, unfortunately, the call was pretty brief. He just stated that he had killed the two teenagers on Lake Herman Road and the couple at Blue Rock Springs, and then he hung up.
And they were able to trace the call.
No, they weren't. The technology back then wasn't what it is today, and the caller was careful not to stay on the line long enough for them to get a trace.
Wow. So it's like he knew what he was doing?
Right, and this actually speaks to something that's really fascinating about the Zodiac case. There's this constant tension between his apparent desire for attention and his need to remain anonymous.
Yeah, it's like he wants to be known, but he doesn't want to be caught.
Exactly. He wants to control the narrative. He wants to be in the spotlight, but on his own terms.
So after this phone call, the police, now they have a serial killer on their hands, and they have this new chilling element of direct communication from the killer himself.
Right, and things are about to escalate even further with the next attack, which takes place on September 27, 1969.
Oh, boy.
This time it's at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, and this is the attack that really starts to solidify the Zodiac's image in the public imagination.
Yeah, this is one with the costume, right?
Exactly. Two college students, Brian Hartnell, who was 20, and Cecilia Shepard, who was 22, were picnicking at the lake when they were approached by a man wearing a bizarre costume.
Bizarre how?
Well, imagine this. He was wearing a black executioner's hood with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes.
Oh my God.
And on the front of his hood was a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, like the crosshairs of a gun sight.
That's so creepy.
It's incredibly unsettling, and it's the symbol that would become synonymous with the Zodiac.
I mean, just the thought of seeing someone approaching you dressed like that.
It's like something out of a nightmare, and to make things even more terrifying, the man claimed to be an escaped convict.
Oh no.
He tied up Hartnell and Shepard and then stabbed them repeatedly.
Oh my God, that's awful.
Cecilia Shepard tragically died from her injuries, but Brian Hartnell survived, and he was able to give a detailed account of the attack to police.
So he was a key witness.
Absolutely. His testimony is one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case.
So what did Hartnell tell the police?
Well, he said that the attacker was methodical and strangely calm throughout the ordeal.
Calm.
Yeah, he wasn't frantic or enraged. He seemed almost rehearsed in his actions.
That's chilling.
And before leaving the scene, the attacker did something that would become another signature of the Zodiac. He used a black felt tip pen to draw that same symbol, the circle with the crosshairs, on the door of Hartnell's car.
Okay, wait a minute. So now he's not just communicating with the police through phone calls. He's leaving these messages at the crime scenes.
Right, and it's this act of leaving his mark that really solidifies his persona as the Zodiac. You know, he's branding his crimes, he's making a statement.
And of course he called the police again, right?
He did. About an hour after the attack, a man called the Napa Police Department from a payphone and claimed responsibility for the stabbings. And in a truly disturbing detail, he even gave the exact time of the attack.
So it's like he's boasting?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. You know, he's reveling in the attention he's creating, this persona of this, unstoppable criminal mastermind.
This is so scary.
And what's even more frightening is that the Lake Berryessa attack wasn't the end of it.
There were more.
Yes. On October 11, 1969, just a couple of weeks after Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac struck again, this time in San Francisco itself.
So he's getting bolder.
He's moving into a major city, and this time his victim was Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver.
And what happened to Paul Stein?
He was shot in the head while driving his cab in the Presidio Heights neighborhood.
Oh my God.
And what makes this case particularly significant is that there were actually eyewitnesses. 3 teenagers saw the killer fleeing the scene, and they were able to give a description to the police.
So finally they have some solid leads.
You'd think so, right? But unfortunately, there was a major mix-up with the initial police dispatch.
What do you mean?
Well, the teenagers described the killer as a white male, but the dispatcher mistakenly broadcast the description as a black male.
Oh no.
Yeah, so the police officers in the area were looking for the wrong person, and the killer was able to escape.
Wow. So a simple mistake like that could have really changed the course of the investigation.
Absolutely, and it's a reminder of how even small details can have huge consequences in a case like this.
So even with the eyewitnesses, the Zodiac still managed to slip away.
He did, and this really speaks to his ability to evade capture. He was careful, he was methodical, and he always seemed to be one step ahead of the police.
So by this point, he's killed 5 people, attacked 3 different couples, and he's communicating directly with the police and the media.
Right, and that communication, that's what really sets the Zodiac apart from other serial killers of the time. He wasn't just killing, he was creating this whole persona, this myth around himself.
Yeah, let's talk about those communications, because they're a huge part of what makes this case so fascinating and so frustrating.
Absolutely. So alongside the attacks, the Zodiac was sending a series of letters and coded messages to various newspapers, primarily the San Francisco Chronicle.
And it's in these letters that he first uses the name Zodiac, right?
It is. He signs his letters with that name and with that same symbol, the circle with the crosshairs.
And what was the purpose of these letters? I mean, was he just boasting about his crimes?
It was more than just boasting. He was taunting the police, he was challenging them to catch him, and he was threatening more violence if his demands weren't met.
What kind of demands?
Well, in one letter, he demanded that the Chronicle publish his writings on the front page of their newspaper. Otherwise, he would unleash a killing spree on the city.
So he was trying to control the media.
He was, and he was incredibly successful at it. His letters generated a huge amount of fear and panic in the Bay Area.
I bet. And on top of the letters, he was also sending these coded messages, these ciphers, right?
Right. These ciphers were a key part of his communication, and they've become a major focus of the investigation even today.
And these ciphers, they were like incredibly complex, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, incredibly complex, made up of hundreds of symbols and letters arranged in these intricate patterns.
And the idea was that if you could crack the cipher, You could reveal his identity.
Well, that was the hope. Many people believed that the ciphers contained clues to his identity or to his motives.
And did anyone ever crack them?
Yes, actually, one of the first ciphers, a 408-character cipher known as the 408 cipher, was solved just a week after it was published by a schoolteacher and his wife.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was a huge breakthrough at the time, and people were hoping that it would lead to the killer's capture.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the cipher didn't contain any specific information about his identity.
So what did it say?
It was mostly a rambling message about his desire to kill and his belief that he was collecting souls for the afterlife.
Okay, that's dark.
It is very dark, and it adds this whole other layer of mystery to the case. What were his true motivations? What was he trying to achieve with all of this?
And weren't there other ciphers that were never solved?
Yes. There's one in particular, a 340-character cipher known as the 340 cipher that has baffled code breakers for decades.
It's still unsolved.
It is, and it's become kind of the holy grail for Zodiac enthusiasts. Many people believe that if that cipher could be cracked, it would finally reveal the killer's identity.
That's crazy. So even today, people are still trying to solve it.
Oh, absolutely. There are entire online communities dedicated to cracking the Zodiac ciphers. And there's been a resurgence of interest in the case in recent years, thanks in part to documentaries and podcasts like this one.
So even though the Zodiac stopped killing in 1969, the mystery surrounding him is still very much alive.
Very much alive, and it shows no signs of fading away.
So with all these attacks and these communications from the Zodiac, the police must have had a ton of leads to follow up on, right?
You'd think so, right? But unfortunately, despite years of investigation and thousands of tips, the case remains officially unsolved.
So they never caught him.
No, they never did. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the limitations of forensic technology at the time. Some of it has to do with the Zodiac's own cunning and ability to avoid capture. And some of it might just be plain bad luck.
Yeah, it's easy to look back now and say, oh, they should have done this or they should have done that. But you have to remember they were dealing with something completely unprecedented at the time.
Right. They were essentially writing the playbook as they went along. That we were learning about this new type of criminal, this media-savvy serial killer who used codes and ciphers to communicate.
So even though they never caught the Zodiac, they must have had some suspects, right?
Oh, they had plenty of suspects over the years. Hundreds of names have been put forward, but there's one in particular that stands out. Arthur Leigh Allen.
This is the guy that a lot of people believe is the most likely suspect. Right?
He was a former school teacher who lived in Vallejo, and there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that seemed to point to him.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, he was identified by a witness in one of the attacks, not as the attacker himself, but as someone who was acting suspiciously in the area around the time of the crime.
Okay.
He also matched the general physical description of the Zodiac, and he had a history of violence against women.
And didn't he own a watch with the Zodiac symbol on it?
He did. He owned a Zodiac brand watch, which is a pretty eerie coincidence.
It is. And what about those ciphers? Did he have any connection to codes or cryptography?
Well, he was known to be interested in codes and ciphers, and he even had a book on cryptography in his possession.
So it sounds like they had a pretty strong case against him.
They did, but there was one major problem. The DNA evidence didn't match.
So they had DNA from the Zodiac.
They had DNA from saliva on the back of some of the stamps on the letters that he sent. And they compared that DNA to Allen's DNA, and it was not a match.
So that basically ruled him out.
Well, it should have, but there's still a lot of debate about the reliability of that DNA evidence. Some people believe that the samples might have been contaminated or that they weren't handled properly.
So even with the DNA evidence not matching, some people still believe that Arthur Leigh Allen was the Zodiac.
They do, and it's easy to see why, he fits the profile in so many ways. And there's just something about the case against him that feels compelling, even if the hard evidence isn't there.
And weren't there other suspects besides Allen?
Oh, yeah. Over the years, there have been numerous other individuals who have been investigated, some of them based on flimsy evidence, some of them based on more compelling leads.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. There's a man named Richard Gaikowski, who was a journalist and a suspect in another unsolved case, the murder of Cherry Jo Bates. Some people believe that Bates was an early victim of the Zodiac and that Gaikowski might be the link.
Okay.
And then there's a guy named Lawrence Kane who worked at the same hotel as one of the Zodiac victims, Darlene Ferrin.
Okay.
And there's also Earl Van Best Jr., who was named as a suspect by his own son decades after the crimes.
His own son.
Yeah, the son claimed that his father had confessed to being the Zodiac on his deathbed, and he presented a lot of circumstantial evidence to support his claims.
Wow, so even within families, this case is causing divisions.
Absolutely. It's a case that has touched so many lives, and it continues to generate speculation and debate to this day.
And all of these suspects, they were never charged with any of the Zodiac crimes.
No, none of them were. And that's part of what makes this case so frustrating. There's all this evidence, there are all these potential leads, but nothing concrete enough to lead to an arrest.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, where you have most of the pieces, but you're missing a few crucial ones.
Exactly. And it's those missing pieces that keep people coming back to this case, trying to fill in the gaps, trying to solve the puzzle.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Zodiac case, I think it's important to acknowledge that we've only scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we really have. There are books, documentaries, websites, entire communities dedicated to this case.
And there's so much more that we could have discussed. The specific details of each attack, the different theories about the ciphers, the psychological profile of the killer.
And even the cultural impact of the case, how it's been portrayed in films and television shows, how it's become this kind of pop culture phenomenon.
Absolutely. But I think what we've done today is give you a good overview of the key facts of the case, and hopefully we've sparked your curiosity to learn more.
And maybe even come up with your own theories.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the Zodiac case, right? It's a mystery that invites everyone to participate, to try to solve it, to try to make sense of it.
And it's a mystery that after all these years still has the power to captivate and terrify us.
So as you go about your day, maybe you're driving to work, maybe you're out for a walk, just think about the Zodiac out there somewhere, maybe still alive, maybe long gone. But his shadow still looms large over the Bay Area and over our collective imagination.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would it take to finally solve this case? Will we ever know for sure who the Zodiac was and why he did what he did?
And maybe more importantly, what does this case tell us about ourselves? About our fascination with the dark side of human nature? About our need to find answers even when they seem impossible to find?
It's a question that will likely haunt us for years to come, just like the mystery of the Zodiac Killer himself.
And with that chilling thought, we'll leave you to ponder the mysteries of the Zodiac case. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic sure to fascinate and intrigue you.